Nice to meet you, everyone, in different parts of the world. So, my background is as a neuroscientist. I think a lot about how people think and behave in relation to climate change. And so, I'll give a very quick introduction to some useful pointers for you to think about when you are thinking of how to activate people in through the games that you're developing. All right, so I want to start with a little thinking activity, which is the mirror image to the activity that we'll end with, where you can all in your own location start doing this on your own. But this one we're going to do together, but individually, basically. And it's about a time where you wanted to take an action because of climate or the environment, but you were unable to carry it out. So think for about a minute about what the action was, the reason that you couldn't do it, and how it made you feel when you got stuck. So see if you can identify one of those actions in your mind. I'll give you 10 more seconds. Okay, I hope you've all been able to identify a moment of that kind, an episode of that kind. What I now would like to ask of every one of you who is in the online space, type how you were feeling in the chat. And if you're in a space in person, just turn to the people next to you and share how this episode made you feel. Okay, so the answers in the chat are coming in fast and they're all about feeling frustrated and helpless and guilty and ashamed, etc., etc. So the dictionary of negative emotions is what we're getting here when we're thinking about these kinds of episodes. So I've done this activity quite a few times in the past, and that sense of frustration is the overarching sense that comes out of this. Like, we want to do something and something is preventing us from doing the thing that we need to do. Now, in quite a few situations in the past, we did then go into the sharing of the examples, and I got to hear from people what the reasons were why they couldn't carry out those actions. And they fall into two very broad categories. The first set of reasons is usually the system doesn't allow me to do the thing that I want to do. Something's getting in the way in terms of either it physically doesn't exist, or it's too expensive, or I don't have the time to figure out how to make it work. So that's one set of categories, one set of reasons. The second set of reasons is usually other people. I wanted other people to play along with me, and they didn't want to do the things that I wanted them to be doing. So that covers about 98% of all the reasons that I've heard when we did go into detail in unpacking the stories of action attempted. So hopefully that covers your reasons as well here. So why do I do this activity? Why do I ask you to start thinking about this? Because it really puts a question mark with what you could think of as the conventional wisdom about behavior change, which we encounter a lot in our work when we are working with people who want to communicate about climate change, who want to get people to take action on climate change. And that conventional wisdom is really about, if only we could give people information about climate change and the environmental crises that are happening, if we could raise their awareness, if we could give them understanding, if we could get them to care about stuff, if we get them concerned or even fearful about stuff, any of those things will then lead to action and behavior change. And what your own example should be um, helping you to question this is that it's not that simple. You might all be caring about climate change, and that care about climate change or the environment might still not translate into action because the system and other people are getting in the way. Now, this is not unique to us as a group here coming together. I'm going to show you a little bit of data that comes out of public opinion polling about climate change. So this is data from Ipsos Mori, asking people how concerned you are about climate change. And they've been asking that question since 2005. I don't want to talk so much about what happened in the past, but what I want to focus on here is that big increase that we see happen from 2013, where it's 60%, to the 85% of concern that we are seeing now. And this is valid for the UK and many European countries. That level of concern is sort of sitting at 85%. So over that period from 2013 to 2020, 2021, you've got like a 25% increase in concern. So keep that in mind as we look at the next piece of data. Because public opinion organizations aren't just asking people, how are you feeling about climate change? They're often also asking people, what are you doing about climate change, or what are you willing to do about climate change? And this is one piece of data, making a comparison between asking that question in 2014 and in 2020. So the light green bars are 2014, the dark green bars are 2020. And remember that across that period of time, concern went up by 25%. What we're seeing here is that people's willingness to take action is barely moving across that same period of time. There's barely any change in that. So what this is doing, what this data is telling us, is that this disconnect between care and concern and willingness to take action and actual action is really big. There isn't like a very strong connection between those. So we need to put an even bigger question mark with that conventional wisdom. Now, psychologists have actually known about this since the 1930s. The 1930s was the first time that psychological research shows that there can be a very big gap between what people say and what people do. And that's expressed as the attitude behavior gap in some branches of psychology. But in environmental psychology, which goes back to the 1970s, that has been called the value action gap. There is a big gap between people's pro-environmental values and then their actual behavior. So this is a little bit damning that we've actually known about this since the 1930s. And yet, when it comes to people wanting to make change on climate change, many of us are still pursuing that conventional wisdom. Many of us are still trying to give information to people, are trying to get them to care, are trying to pull their emotional levers like fear or hope or concern in order to get them to act. But what the psychology is telling us, it's not really the direction in which things go. It's not really what can make that change happen. So what's wrong with that conventional view? Why isn't it working that way? And the reason is, one of the main reasons is that often people don't know how to overcome the barriers that are put up by the system and other people. So that may also have been the reasons why you, in your own examples, couldn't translate that care into action, because you had the system or other people like not wanting to play along, and you didn't know how to overcome those barriers. So for many other people across society, that is exactly the same situation. Now, psychologists have a word to describe those situations where we do know how to act, where we do know what it is that we need to do to turn our attitudes into behavior. And that word is agency. For psychologists, the word agency really means knowing how to do something, knowing how to take action. And my favorite example of agency is doctors and nurses who are working in an accident and emergency department. They are sitting in this highly stressful situation. There's a constant stream of emergencies coming through the door, patients that are arriving with ambulances that are arriving of their own accord. And those doctors and nurses in that situation, they've been trained to really instinctively and intuitively almost know how to respond to those emergency situations. Now, if you put me on the floor of that emergency department, I will be like a headless chicken. I will not know what to do in that situation. And the tragedy is that when it comes to climate change, most people are like the layperson on the floor of an E department. Most people are like the headless chicken. And it doesn't then matter that people on the sideline are shouting, you should do more, you should take urgent action to deal with these emergencies. That is not going to make any difference with that helplessness. We do not know how to respond in that situation. Now, a perhaps slightly shocking thing that I would say here is that this lack of agency that we're experiencing, that not knowing how to take action, plays out for almost everyone in society, but it plays out differently for when we're talking about ourselves as citizens, as consumers, as people who are making decisions about our own consumption behavior. But it also happens with politicians, with people in business, in finance organizations, with media professionals, etc. We work a lot with them at the Climate Action Unit. We work a lot with politicians, with people working in business organizations. And they often tell us, we know that it's a serious situation and we know that we should be doing more, but we don't know how we can be doing more, given all the other constraints, all the other problems that we are under, basically. So what do we do? What's the alternative to that conventional wisdom? If we can't really change people's attitudes to get them to change their behavior, then what's the alternative? Well, it's to flip around that arrow, to think about this in the way that the behavior that we are doing is actually driving the attitudes that we have. And that brings us to an insight that is underpinned by lots of research in neuroscience and psychology, that in real life, our actions are driving our beliefs far more often than our beliefs driving our action. And here's an image to really drive that home. It's the actions that are doing the heavy lifting in how we are thinking about the world. And there's a couple of simple reasons for that. The first one is like, once you do something for the first time, once you take an action for the first time, you usually discover something new. You get some feedback from people around you. You get some sign that actually the thing that you thought you couldn't be doing, that you actually can be doing it. And that positive feedback that you said that you get, that says like, hey, this thing that I thought I couldn't do, I now discover that I can do it. That then makes it possible for us to start thinking about what's our next step, what's the next step, the next thing that we can be doing. So that's one reason for it. The second reason is almost mechanical at the level of our brain. It's like once we do something, our brains start justifying to ourselves the things that we are doing. And mostly that is because we want to feel good about the action that we've just taken. So that's a sort of a thing that happens almost automatically for all of us when we do something. And that's something that we can use here to help ourselves and to help other people find how they can start acting on climate and environmental issues. Now, that brings us to the take-home messages for this insight on actions drive beliefs, that the only reliable form of persuasion that actually exists is self-persuasion. So if you go to the bookshop right now, you will find entire books, an entire shelf full of books on persuasion. And unfortunately, there are very few books on self-persuasion. But that process where people start doing something and then change their own understanding of that thing, that's what psychology calls self-persuasion. That's actually the thing that works the only thing that works all of the time. So persuasion sometimes works, but the only thing that works all of the time is when people do it themselves, when people start changing their own belief system. The second take-home message here is that action, once people start taking an action and that changes their understanding, changes their belief in themselves that they can be doing something, that then means that action starts to inspire other action. We do something, we figure out what the next step is that we can be doing. And that then makes that question of how do we change people's behavior, it turns it into a different question. It turns it into the question, how do we collectively develop our agency to be dealing with climate change and the environmental problems that we're dealing with? So it's helping people to figure out how to take action that we need to be doing rather than thinking about how do I manipulate them so that they actually will change their behavior. So how can we use this in games, and how can we use this in communication and storytelling in general, and games being one component of that? So here's the golden nugget. The first thing to do is that you need to create opportunities for action for people, and that you can do within your game context. And the second thing to do is that you need to show people how to take action rather than telling them what they should be doing. So don't say you should be doing this. Show a story, tell a story of how they actually can be taking a certain action. And the reason for that, the primary reason for that, is that once you tell a story of how people do something, I did this, and then I took a next step, and then I got a bit stuck, but I found a way around this. So that story of action is the thing that creates agency in other people. And the reason for that is that most of our agency is social. We see other people solve a problem and we learn from that, and we learn to apply the recipes that they have developed for dealing with their problems to us solving our own problems. My favorite example of that one is Greta Thunberg. She wasn't sitting in her room just trying to think through how she was going to get lots of people on the street. No, she saw students after a school shooting in Florida take to the streets, and she said, if they can do this protesting on that school shooting, then I can do this on climate change. So she learned from the example of other people. She then went and sat in front of Parliament in Sweden, and the rest is history. Her own actions started to serve as example as well to other people. So what's really important here is that you need to help people to understand how to change. So you need to provide them with recipes, not just menu items. And once you do that, you will create a sense in them. If they can do it, then I can do it as well. So a second component here to keep in mind before we're going to the activity, in a second we're going to the activity. But if the system is the thing that gets in the way, I remember from our first activity is a system and other people that get in the way. If the system is one of the sources of barriers that prevent people from happening, then some of the stories that we need to tell each other is not about individual change. It's not about how you change as a person, but it's about how can we change the system around us such that we can make better choices. And I'm not talking here about overthrowing capitalism and replacing it with something else, although some of you might want to tell a story about that, and that's fine if you do. But I'm talking more about the everyday environment and surroundings in which we are making choices. If I go, so I know that one of the themes of the Green Game Jam is waste. If I go to the supermarket and the only vegetables that I can buy are wrapped in plastic, then no amount of individual care about that plastic will allow me to change my behavior if the only place where I can buy my vegetables is in that supermarket. So what I mean with changing the system then is to come up with actions that get the supermarkets to understand that they need to change their behavior in order for people to make better choices in their day-to-day life. So that brings us to the activity, which is called Action Inspired. And I'm going to leave this as the moment, I think, Deborah, for the physical spaces to sign off from the call. Is that correct?
That's right. So I don't know if maybe you want to take people through the activity and then they can log off, or it's better to do it in person. The facilitators have these slides, so if it's better
I
to do
think
it
it
in
might be
person,
better
they
to
can.
just take people through first because I think one or two places have the slides but haven't had time to properly look at them. So
Okay,
yeah, I think
all right.
take
I'll
Cool. So he can
explain
give us a
it.
dry run and then
yeah.
we will log off and do our thing.
Okay,
Thank you.
cool. Thank you. So, how is it going to work? I'm going to ask you a question to think again about something that happened in your own past, as we did in the opening activity. Give you about 2 minutes to think of an example on your own, perhaps make some notes. Then everyone will share that example in small groups. There will be then afterwards time for a bit of plenary reflection. And believe me, it's important to not skip any of these steps. So that individual thinking before you start talking about this is important. Because otherwise you immediately create a bit of groupthink where the first example will color all of the other examples that you'll be discussing. So what is needed? Something to write down a few notes, pen and paper, or a screen that you can make some notes on. And then later on, specifically in the physical space, sit together in small groups of 6 to 8 people. In the online space, we will go into breakout rooms. So um, the individual thinking, the question that I'd like you to think about is the following. Think of a moment when someone's action served as a source of inspiration for you to do something, where you learned from someone else's example, or where you saw another person be inspired by someone else's story of action. So where you were the observer of someone being inspired by someone else. Take 2 minutes to note down the source of the action. So, who was it that you saw as a source of inspiration, and what is it that they were doing? And how did it help you to start doing what you did? Or how did it help the other person that you then noticed doing something start doing what you did? And the inspiration for your action can be climate related or it can be something else. And the action itself can be from your personal, professional, or community context. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think about this on your own. So the way to now share these examples where you were inspired by someone else's action is that make sure that you sit together in roughly equally sized groups. And then just in turn, share your action inspired example with your group members. Take about 2 minutes each for that initial round of sharing. And if you've got any time left, then you can respond to the examples that you've heard. If you are then, if you're sitting in a larger group, if you're sitting with more people in the physical space, then once you come out of that small group sharing, I would invite you to reflect on that in the group and to go through perhaps some of these prompts for discussion here. So, what did you notice about the ability of stories of action to inspire others? Are the stories that you heard in your group only about individual behavior change? Or did you also come up with examples of people changing their system? And then the third point, which then brings you to your task over the coming weeks and months, is this already sparking ideas into how that you can build ideas of stories of action into games? So, but first, that sharing across the group. So this is the moment for the physical spaces to log off, and then for Alex to send us to the breakout rooms.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And I'm sure we'll all be in touch very soon. And thank you so much for Kris.